Thank you. So, those of you who know me know that I taught Old Testament at Stirling Theological College for about 28 years, I think it was. And one of the early people who I read when I was studying for my own degree was a guy called Robert Alter. This book, The Art of Biblical Narrative, came out in the early 80s. And I think you could say it changed my life. I was about to say, it was like having a spotlight turned on the Bible. And just at that moment, the spotlights were turned on. So there you go. Robert Alter was, he possibly still is. No, he'd be retired by now. He was a lecturer in English literature at one of the big universities in the US, a Jewish man, who decided that he would really like to dig down into his own stories, the stories of his faith and tradition, and try to work out why they were so different and differently told to English stories which come from the Greek tradition. So he spent a lot of time looking at the patterns and the way narrative was put together, and came up with this wonderful book. And around about the same time, different people around the world were starting to move into looking at that as well. One of the reasons I'm fascinated by that is because until that time I had only heard the Bible, like probably a lot of you had, little snippets read out in a dull voice on Sunday mornings out of context. Apart from the stories they told us in Sunday school, which seemed to be a lot more interesting than that, but they tended to be stories we either didn't spend a lot of time with in church or we were told what they meant. So, what I would like to do, because I did a semester unit on this, and I've got 20 minutes or something here, is to have a look at how Hebrew narrative works over 2 weeks. So this month I'm going to have a look at repetitions and word plays and allusions to other things and the way they're brought into play to enliven the story and to keep us focused on what's important. Remembering that a lot of these stories would have had their birth in oral tradition. And in oral tradition, you can't flip back to the page before because you've forgotten something. You're reminded of what's important by the way things are repeated to keep you up to date with what's going on. And we're going to do this by having a look at Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac, because I think probably everybody knows this story. I have no idea when I first heard the story. It was part of my growing up, it's just always been there. It didn't mean anything much because I'd heard it way too often. But my daughter was about 3 when she first heard it. Someone was using it as a communion talk about, the murder of a small child by their father. She started screaming and I had to take her out of church. And for the first time I realised there's actually something quite shocking about this story when someone hears it for the first time without the kind of theological fluff that's put around it that takes away the power of it, basically. So I'm going to go through it bit by bit. And by the way, look at the picture there, which I think is an amazing image of narrative. Lots of different points of view, lots of things all happening that you have to work out where do they come in the story, what way does the plot go, who's important, what's the relationship between people, all of those questions that we kind of do automatically when we're reading books, when we're watching films, but which we often don't think to bring to biblical text. And the thing with repetition is that often we just put off by it because it just sounds like it's saying the same thing over and over again. So what I'm going to do is go through the story as it's translated by Robert Alter, who, by the way, has now done a 3-volume set of translations of the whole Hebrew Bible. So that's the first one, the Books of Moses. Fantastic. I mean, they're just, if you want to get a sense of how Hebrew works, but you don't want to have to learn Hebrew, that's a good way to start. So, am I holding that the right way? Okay. Michael, can you send me on? Thank you. One of the things that you're going to notice is that there are a lot of different colours. I've tried to pick up repetitions, either repetitions of words in Hebrew that sound a lot like other words in Hebrew, or direct repetitions, and give you a sense of how complex these stories are and how they're woven together by ideas that take us through. So, let's start. And it happened after these things that God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. And he said, Take, pray, your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. You'll notice, take note of your only son, the one you love, and the name Isaac, which is Yitzhak, which comes from the verb to laugh. It also sounds like a bunch of other words which we're going to come across. And go forward to the land of Moriah, which sounds a lot like the word for sight, which yireh, to see, which we're going to come across in various ways too. And offer him up as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall say to you. Okay, this doesn't seem to be working. My little clicky thing. Am I doing it right? Yeah. Am I holding it the right way around? Sorry, we'll get there.
There's always some kind of magic with these things.
Okay, which one am I supposed to be?
The middle
it is that one.
Just a tap, yeah?
Oh, okay, right here.
Yeah, I think you're holding it now for too long.
Yeah, I probably am. I'm too anxious. I'm squeezing it instead of tapping it.
You're doing well.
Thank you. Excuse my wheezing, it's a throat thing. And Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took his 2 lads with him, and Isaac his son. Now note his son, it's done in purple there, so you can't really tell it that much. And he split wood, atzi, so another word that is a bit of a sound like Yatzak, Isaac, split wood for the offering, and rose and went to the place that God had said to him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes, and Yireh saw the place from afar. And Abraham said to his lads, Sit you here with the donkey, and let me and the lad walk ahead, and let us worship and return to you. Tap. It doesn't like my fingers. Oh, there we go. How far did I go? Too far? No, that was right. Beautiful. And Abraham took the wood, remember that wood has the same sort of sound as the word for Isaac, for the offering, and put it on Yitzhak, his son, and again his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the cleaver, and the 2 of them went together. The 2 of them went together. That's going to be something that returns. And Isaac said to Abraham, his father, Father, and he said, Here I am, my son. You might be already starting to notice that family connections are forefronted. They're repeated over and over again. And he said, Look. Now the word look, hine in Hebrew, was what used to be translated as behold in the old King James Version. And in the King James Version, it sort of became a kind of parsonic, behold, the angel of the Lord. And so in modern versions, it's left out completely. But in fact, it's a direction. It's like a stage direction. Look. And it's actually leading our eyes to a particular viewpoint. So it takes us somewhere where we haven't been. So here we are, look. Here is the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the offering? And Abraham said, God will see to it, yireh, which is very similar to the word to provide. And in fact, it's hard to tell which word is being used here. So provide, see, again, a play on words. God will see to the sheep for the offering, my son. Little bit of play on words there too, because there's no commas or other punctuation in Hebrew. God will see to the offering, my son. Or God will see to the offering, comma, my son, which is how it's usually translated in English. A lot more ambiguous in Hebrew. And the two of them went together, again, together. And they came to the place that God had said to him, and Abraham built there an altar and laid out the wood, Yitzhak, and bound Yitzhak, his son, and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. That close relationship between Isaac and the wood is forefronted by the sound all the way through. And Abraham reached out his hand and took the cleaver to slaughter his son. Do we know that Isaac is Abraham's son by now? I think we kind of do. We've had our noses rubbed in it the whole way. And the Lord's messenger called out to him from the heavens and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not reach out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear Yireh. Again, it's a sound that sounds a lot like Yira, to see, God, and you have not held back your son, your only one, from me. So this takes us right back to the beginning where God tells him to go and slaughter his son, his only one. And Abraham raised his eyes and saw, and look, another of this hine, look, a ram was caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place Yahweh Yireh, as it said on this day, on the mount of the Lord there is sight, or it will be provided, depending on which way you want to translate that word. Probably both ways, because Hebrew is very clever like that. If it can make one word do multiple meanings and make the translation or possibilities or the mental pictures that much richer, it will. And the Lord's messenger called out to Abraham once again from the heavens, and he said, By my own self I swear, declares the Lord, that because you have done this thing and have not held back your son, your only one, and by the way, anything that's repeated is important. If it's repeated 3 times, it's really important. I will greatly bless you, and you will greatly multiply your seed as the stars in the heavens and as the sand on the shore of the seas, and your seed shall take hold of its enemy's gate. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed. Now, those of you who are listening closely and know your Bibles well are starting to think, I've heard this before. Yes, you have. And Abraham returned to his lads, and they rose and went together, there again, that go together, to Beersheba. And Abraham dwelled in Beersheba. So there is the story with just a few of the wonderful little things highlighted that the Hebrew writers do. So how does it work as story? Instead of systematic theology or analogy to the death of Jesus or all the other things that we've had it sort of preached as probably during our lives. Certainly I've heard it like that. There are all sorts of things that are happening in story. There's plot, there's character, there are repetitions, all sorts of patterns, and you've heard some of them. First of all, there's a wider context which this story draws in. It is, in fact, very much a bookend to the calling of Abraham, right back in chapter 12. Go forth, lech lecha, and he's told to get up and go forth, lecha, from your land, from your kin, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you, to where I will show you. The language is almost identical. It also has a bit of an envelope effect, an inclusio with the take your son, your only one, the one you love, Isaac, and go forth to the land of Moriah and offer him up on one of the mountains. So you've got sort of intensifying levels of separation from the land, from your kin, from your father's house. Take your son, your only one, the one you love, and go forth. And in both there is this unspecified, unknown future. We've got all those repetitions that keep Isaac in our minds as sacrifice by comparing his word, the word for Isaac, with the word for wood, that just keeps banging on our ears all the way through if we're reading it in Hebrew. The versions of the word to see, 7 times. It appears 7 times through here. There is something about seeing that binds this story together. It's really important. You fear God. I mean, fear is another, it's a slightly turned around 3-letter. All Hebrew verbs, or most Hebrew verbs, have a 3-letter core. And sometimes they'll switch the letters around for a different word, but you're meant to be hearing the other word as well. So we're told that there's a test. We don't know what of. We're told that God, or the way Alter translates, recognises that God doesn't just tell him. The Hebrew translation, or the English translations are often just, God says, take your son, your only one. But Alter points out that in the Hebrew, the ending of take is a question. Take, please. Take, pray, is how he translates it. So there's a sense that God understands in the story that there's something pretty momentous that he's asking here. So we've got this image of a story, or a story about an event in a family life. Now, at the beginning, it happened after these things that God tested Abraham. And we might ask, what things? So if you go back to the story before, Abraham has just sent away Ishmael, his other son. Sent him out into the desert. For all he knows, he's died in the desert, though God told him, don't be afraid of sending him away, I'll look after him. But he doesn't know what's happened to Ishmael. So is there something there about your son, your only one? Are we meant to think, well, maybe Ishmael has now died? All sorts of questions that might rise for us. And one of the things about Hebrew narrative is it leaves a lot of gaps. It doesn't tell us everything. English narrative, after the Greek, tends to fill in all the gaps. It tends to say this happens because of that, and they were feeling this at the time, and then that happened, and it's all pretty much explained. But in Hebrew, very sparse. And so we get to fill in the gaps, or at least notice the gaps, and wonder what happens in the middle of them. So some of the gaps, and you might think of other ones, only son. Does this refer to, as I said, the ending of the previous story? What's happened to Ishmael? What's the character of God? Big gap here in demanding this sort of test. What does it tell us? What should we think about the character of God? What about the character of Abraham in accepting without question? Does this mean that he sees this as consistent with Yahweh's character and reasonable? Does he think he's playing chicken? See who blinks first? We don't know. The character of Abraham also in deceiving. We're not told about Sarah. What does he say to the kid's mother? Anybody thought of that? What happens to how does he take off? Okay, he tells the young lads that he takes with him that they're going to go together and sacrifice, and then we'll return to you. But as far as he knows, it'll only be him returning. We don't know. And of course, the ambiguity of that phrase, God will see to the sacrifice, my son. Isaac disappears from the narrative at the stage of the sheep. Abraham returned to his lads. It doesn't say they returned, just Abraham returns. And one of the big gaps, and it's one that the rabbis had a wonderful time with, I'll let you into some of the rabbinic gap filling because it's terrific a little bit later, is what's Sarah's reaction when they come back. In the very next narrative, the next chapter, we learn about the death of Sarah, and one of the Hebrew rabbinic stories is that when she hears what Abraham has done, threatening the life of her son, she screams and falls down dead. Okay, reasonable bit of gap filling. Why not? I want to leave it there though. I could go on for hours and let's not. And I would like you to actually gather yourselves into, or be gathered into some rooms, and just to talk with each other over maybe a couple of questions. One being, what have you heard that you hadn't heard before? And is there any difference that this makes to how you hear this story? So there might be questions you have, there might be gaps that you hadn't noticed before that now you're really curious about. Just what difference does it make hearing it as narrative, beautifully composed narrative, rather than doctrine, systematic theology, however else, sermon illustration, that you've heard it before? Letting the story speak for itself. Let's see what you come up with. And I think we can sort of probably go for about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll gather back and see if there's anything anybody wants to feedback. We can do that, can we? Yeah, write in the chat anything that you'd like to feed back. And I will just finish off by reading you some of the rabbinic questions and responses to this, because the rabbinic traditions read things quite differently from what a lot of the Christian traditions do. Okay, so I gather we're back again. So has anybody got any questions or feedback that they would like to type in? I think that's probably the way we're doing it at the moment. So Rosemary's just gone in to have a look and she'll feed it back to me. It's all a little bit clunky, but there you go. While that's happening, maybe just to talk about a place or two that this story seems to get picked up. One of them is the story of Jephthah and his daughter in Judges 11. Took us a while to find it, but I knew it was in Judges somewhere. And very similar language is used of the daughter, your one, the only one who you love. And I think there's quite a deliberate reference because biblical narratives loves doing this, loves quoting other stories, that when Jephthah makes his vow that he will sacrifice the first thing that comes through the gates to meet him when he comes home, if he comes home victorious from the war, we've already been told that the Spirit came upon him, which is a cue for he will come home victorious. So the vow that he makes is actually useless. He wasn't asked to make it. And he ends up sacrificing his daughter rather than not having to sacrifice with Abraham. So there's something that's faithless about Jephthah. And we are told at the beginning of his story that he is an outcast from his family, and we're told at the end that basically he dies, his daughter dies, end of story. The very next judge who's raised after Jephthah, the only thing we're told about him is that he has a gazillion sons and daughters, dies very old with all of his family around him. Okay, we have a question. We thought that the whole story is historical fiction and that it didn't actually happen. Why would God test Abraham by instructing him to kill his son? If the shock of that story made Sarah die, it's a horrible story. It's a horrible story in all sorts of ways. Why it's told, I mean, stories are stories are stories. Whether there was ever such a person as Abraham, whether any of this happened, we simply don't know. What we have is the story, which a narrator has put together with great skill to get us thinking about something. And the something could be all sorts of things. One of the things that came up in our little group here was certainly one of the common readings of it, that at the time there was child sacrifice and that this is a story that might have been told against child sacrifice, that that's not something that is required. There is something about the testing of Abraham. We know that God tested Abraham. Abraham doesn't know that in the story. It's something the narrator tells us, but Abraham isn't told. So there are all sorts of little bits and pieces that we simply don't know. Let me just read you. Whoops, we got some more. On the surface of it, the story is unethical. What sort of divinity requires spilling of blood? This idea seems not relevant in context of modern society and ethics. So what relevance is the narrative for us today? Really good question. Again, it's a story. What's the invitation of the story? To walk away from it? Feel free. To grapple with the difficulties of family relationships. I think a lot of the Abraham stories actually invite us into that space of how hard families are. You've got all the tensions between Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Abraham caught in the middle, Abraham not acting particularly well in a lot of that. Maybe it's a question about how do we see our heroes and do we put them on such a pedestal that we don't have to bother trying to work out what it means to live a faithful life? Maybe the questions are, if our heroes are pretty ambiguous characters, somewhat like us, we actually have to work a little bit harder at it. Don't know, just some of the questions that come up. Let me just give you some of the things that the rabbis have come up with in the Haggadah over the years. First of all, how old was the beloved son when he was subjected to this awful ordeal? So here are ancient rabbis saying, is this a story of child abuse? And they work out at different times, going by various bits in the narrative, 25 or maybe 37 are some of the responses they come up with. Read the Haggadah for yourself if you want to see their reasoning. But it's really interesting that the question was asked in the first place. So, did he resist, considering life more important than the commandment to honour father and mother? No, he freely offered himself as a sacrifice to God. Now, some of the Christian art, you might not have seen it all that well, but the very first picture after this one was from Chartres Cathedral. There it is. And you've got this pious little Isaac with his hands crossed in a sort of very prayerful act, looking up at the heavens as his father's about to take the knife to his throat. So this image of sacrifice being what God requires of us and we must give ourselves up to it was very much a reading that the church endorsed. But in fact, the story doesn't. Your son, your father, your son, my father, and then don't, the final don't do it that comes across pretty strongly. That doesn't endorse this at all. Then you've got how did Sarah react with the hearing of her husband's secretive behaviour? She let out a frightening shriek and died. I think it's interesting that the rabbis even asked the question. Nice to know they thought about Sarah. The narrative tells us nothing, of course, nothing at all about Sarah. Where did the actual sacrifice take place? Did the episode permanently alter the relationship between father and son? And they said, yes, it did, because the rabbis couldn't imagine how it wouldn't. And can you imagine? I mean, ghastly thing to happen. Did it alter the relationship between Abraham and God? And the rabbis said, yes, it did. Again, it's not a question that we would necessarily have thought of. And on it goes. Lots and lots and lots of questions. Something that's just come up on the chat. Was child sacrifice common in surrounding cultures? Yes, under particular circumstances it seems that it was. Terrific book by... Sorry? Levinson, thank you. The Sacrifice of the Beloved Child, which goes through a lot of the ancient Near Eastern practices of the day, which, ancient... sorry, I'm having great trouble thinking of words at the moment. Carthage, I think it's ancient Carthage actually, archaeological digs have found many, many, many pots buried with infants in them. And they seem to come from similar sort of times. And they wonder whether at particular times of danger, child sacrifice is practiced. So it's not something that happened all the time, but in times of great practice, great danger. Okay, Fiona here was just saying that John Levinson has a podcast. Anyway, look up John Levinson, JonLevenson. He's another Jewish writer. He's fabulous. The Bible for Normal People.
Episode or whatever, but it's child sacrifice in the Bible.
Child sacrifice in the Bible. So well worth looking up. He's a terrific writer. Another question, did Abraham make a bad mistake? We don't know. He appears to have passed the test, is all we can say from reading this. God tested Abraham. In the end, the fact that Abraham doesn't have to sacrifice Isaac after all appears to say that he passed. That's all we can say, looking at the logic of the story itself. And let's not forget the sacrifice of Jesus. Don't even know where to go with that one, because there has been, so many thousands, I suspect, of books written on the theology of sacrifice around the death of Jesus. Is it the sacrifice of a son by a father, in which case it's child abuse? Is it self-sacrifice, which seems to be more what it's talking about? Many, many, many theologians have written a lot about what it was actually happening, and the different levels of theology around it through the ages kind of say more about what was happening at the ages than they do about the theology of what was going on. But certainly it's in the context of the sacrifice of Jesus that I suspect most of us have heard the story. And one of the comments in our little group was, could you have even had the story written the way it is, the story of the death of Jesus, without the story of Genesis 22? Good question. It certainly sets something up. I want to just end maybe with a response by Immanuel Kant. Kant, however you want to pronounce it. Kant. He said, there are certain cases in which man can be convinced that it cannot be God whose voice he thinks he hears, when the voice commands him to do what is opposed to the moral law. Though the phenomenon seemed to him ever so majestic and surpassing the whole of nature, he must count it a deception. Interesting. He says, Abraham should have said to God, that I am not going to kill my beloved son is quite certain. That you who appear to me are God, I am not certain, nor can I ever be, even if the voice thunders from the skies. I think one of the things that he's telling us is, this doesn't end with go thou and do likewise. We have tended to, or over the years, often the stories have been taken as telling us how we must live, and quite often abusively. You know, they haven't been actually taken in a way that invites us to wonder about human relationships, about relationships with God, and all good stories are invitations to wonder, including biblical ones. Thank you all for coming. It's been, well, I think it's been good being here with you. I can't see any of you, but it's been nice being here with the few who are here. And thank you very much for bearing with me as we went through that story. Do you want to say anything, Rosemary? Okay, it looks like we're done now, so go and enjoy the rest of your, what are we, Sunday? And I'll see you at the end of September. Okay.